Welcome to Millennium Counseling Center's podcast, where each week we go in depth into all things mental health, addiction recovery, and being our healthiest and happiest self. Enjoy. Derek, so one of the hurdles or challenges in people's early recovery, and maybe throughout their entire recovery, is this idea of reaching out and trying to make connections with others, trying to get help from others when they may be struggling. What are you seeing with clients around this? And what are you suggesting to people when they're talking about this idea of kind of asking for help or bringing other people into what's going on with them?
Yeah, I think this is a really big topic and subject and a very important one. I think that this is one of the ways that people can really stay on the right track, regardless of what they're looking for. And I think it's a really hard thing to do. I think that to ask for help for human beings feels like a vulnerability. And so I think we generally want to have a narrative to the world that we're doing well. And by reaching out and telling someone you need support, sometimes that can be really difficult for people. With that being said, I think it is one of the most important ways to stay on the right track, and helping people learn how to do that and particularly get comfortable with it, I think can be a really great tool for them to kind of continue on a really solid, healthy path.
Yeah. I'd say in the last 5, 6 years, I've heard this kind of new definition of addiction. Addiction is the opposite of connection. And so one of the things that I'm doubling down on with people is how any stage of recovery is really hard to do alone. And, a lot of our time spent in recovery is by ourselves. Even if we're going to a meeting every day, even if we're doing therapy, a lot of the time we're kind of alone with our thoughts, alone kind of in our own decision making. And if something comes up and we haven't yet practiced the mechanism of reaching out and letting somebody know about what's going on with us, we got to go through that alone. And that makes it a lot harder to stay on the path.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that the key that I found for that is that we have to try to get comfortable with that when things are going well. And that's kind of one of our strategies in our 3A program is we encourage a lot of communication. And, one of the things that I tell people when they're working with us is that we will, through different ways of being in touch at different times in the day, that if you haven't had a lot of time with somebody or a connection with them, then making that call or text or whatever it is really, really difficult. But if this is someone you're in pretty consistent communication with, then it's much easier to kind of open up those lines of communication when you're struggling. And so I think that the strategy of how to do that is to, when you're doing well and things are going well, I think that, it's important that we kind of make that a commonplace that there is a lot of communication. So I think that breaks down some of the barriers of reaching out when you need some help and some support. And it doesn't feel as much like you're exposing yourself because it's a much more comfortable contact. And as we work with people and spend, particularly in 3A, when we're spending a lot of time with these people, kind of individually, then it makes it much easier for them to reach out when they're in trouble and when they really, really need some extra support. So I do think that's one of the keys. And, kind of anecdotally, I don't know what the, statistics are on this, but what I do know is that if somebody's about to make an unhealthy decision and go down a path that they're going to regret, they reach out to someone that they kind of associate with the work that they're doing in recovery, whether it be a therapist, whether it be a fellow person in recovery, whether it be a family member. I think if this is someone that kind of, when they think of them, they associate with being healthy and making good decisions and trying to get their life on the right path, then that is something that I have seen anecdotally be very effective in kind of in that moment when somebody could go either direction. Being able to connect with somebody is one of the most effective ways to make sure we're staying on the healthy path.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's a muscle that we're learning to work out so that it's able to be used at a time when we may need it, right? So all those calls and reach outs when things aren't necessarily a struggle is really building up that mechanism, that capability of doing so when you actually need it. And I guess one of the things that I try to share with people is that it's not just about waiting until the end, right? So if we're talking about substance use recovery, it's not just about reaching out with this idea of struggling with a thought of drinking or in a situation where drinking or using a drug is kind of imminent, but it's way before that, right? It's planning something or remembering something. And so kind of the idea of reaching out and getting support can't just wait till the very end and think that that's going to be what's going to kind of bring you back. I mean, so what I try to kind of talk to people about is it's got to start, the reach out starts really early on with kind of some of those initial thoughts or feelings about going in a different direction.
Yeah, for sure. And one of the ways that I describe it to people is that, and we'll just take one specific thing. Let's say someone struggles with alcohol. To get to the point of actually drinking the alcohol, you have to make several decisions that are kind of taking a step in the wrong direction. So, one decision might be people ask how you're doing, and you say you're doing fine when you're struggling. The second thing might be if you're going outside to walk by a liquor store that you've gone to in the past. The third decision is to walk into that store, right? The fourth decision is to go down that aisle, pick up whatever you want to buy, and then actually purchasing it and then bringing it wherever you're going to bring it to and actually taking the drink. There's several decisions there where if we in that moment make the right decision, if we tell someone that we're not doing well, if we decide not to walk down that street, if we never go into the store, all of those decisions will divert us from making a decision that we're not going to feel good about and ultimately is going to kind of create chaos in our lives and a setback. And, the thing that I always tell people is that it's much easier to, if you're feeling like that and you feel like you want to drink or use or whatever it is, then in the moment when you're deciding to go for a walk, it is much easier to pull out at that point and not go for a walk and just stay home, assuming there's no alcohol in the house. And that decision is much easier to make than it is when you're sitting at your kitchen table with a bottle in front of you and trying not to drink at that moment. So I think it's about being proactive, but at the same time, it's understanding. And kind of my joke is look, you're not walking down the street and you trip on a bottle of vodka and it falls in your mouth, right? You have to make some decisions before that are putting, you at risk to kind of head down that path. And at any point, if we can kind of divert from that path, then it is going to potentially keep us from making a decision that we are not going to feel good about.
Yeah. So what happens in that reach out? What happens when people connect, when there's, you're somewhere on that spectrum of kind of thinking about youth or acting out or whatever it is? What do you think actually happens kind of during that time?
Well, what I tell people is, as I'm encouraging them to do that, I tell them, like, look, I don't have some magical sentence that I'm going to be able to say that is going to be super impactful. But I think just the act of reaching out, I think that what happens is many times for people when they're doing these behaviors, it's very secretive. And part of that is that there's kind of this thought process that if no one knows, then it's not as bad or it doesn't need to be a problem or whatever that is. And the real issue is that right? That but I think just the act of, by reaching out in that moment, what you're saying is, listen, I'm thinking this way, I'm feeling this way, and it's a secret inside of me and I'm holding on to it. And as soon as you reach out and you kind of open that door, then what you're doing is exposing the secret. And by exposing that secret, you are taking some of the power of that away because you're no longer able to kind of internally convince yourself that no one needs to know. Now you're telling someone that, I'm in a tough place. And so what's going to happen then is that there's going to be a reaction and there'll probably be more communication and there will be, kind of checking in and those types of things. And so what it does is it kind of takes you out of that place of, as you mentioned, of isolation and kind of being just caught in your own thoughts. And now what we're doing is we're kind of telling, I'm telling someone else. And ideally, who you're telling is someone who you associate with your recovery. So I think it's two things. I think one is it's just the act of making a decision to kind of expose this and bring it to light. And then I think the second thing is as you mentioned before, it's that connection, and not just a connection, but a connection with somebody that you associate with healthy behaviors. And because the work we do with people is around a lot of those things, around kind of concentrating on healthy behaviors and figuring out how to rebuild self esteem and make good choices, then by them connecting again with one of us or with a someone that they associate with their recovery, whether it's a family member or friend, at that moment, then what we're doing is we're kind of shifting our mind out of that track, which is moving towards unhealthy decisions. And now we're connecting with somebody that you associate with healthy decisions. And that can kind of divert us back onto heading in the right direction.
Yeah, I agree with you. I don't think there is a magic sentence that anybody can say that ultimately kind of takes somebody kind of off of that talk track or that thought track. But it's amazing that, you know, we all kind of are in a certain place at any given time. And whether it's 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes later, we can be in a different place. And so for me, it's less about kind of thinking that there's like a silver bullet or a magic thing that someone's going to say. And it's more about just realizing that all thoughts pass, all feelings pass. And one of the most effective ways for that to happen is to get someone else involved.
Yeah. And I think that the way, if you talk to people, and I would agree with this, that the way they describe it is that for the most part, if you ask someone, for instance, who's in recovery, if they want to stay in recovery or be in recovery, their cognitive understanding of that is, yes, I would like to do that. That is a decision that I want to make. And what happens in that moment is when that's starting to shift, then people kind of describe it as almost a temporary insanity. And so the act of reaching out and connecting someone can help us snap out of that and kind of come back to what our original intention is, which is to be able to stay on that right track. And, I think you can avoid a lot of, one of the hard things in early recovery is a lot of shame and regret and guilt for past behaviors. And so because we don't want to repeat those and because they're working hard to kind of feel better about themselves in general, if we can avoid one of these situations, which is why it is so important in early recovery and all of recovery, I guess, but in early recovery to make sure that we don't have any setbacks, because what that does is then it kind of shifts the focus from moving forward and being healthy. And then the focus goes to handling the crisis and getting back on track. So these little decisions that we're making, as simple as whether I'm, if I'm in a bad place and I'm going to go walk outside and put myself in a position where I could potentially go do something that I'm not going to feel good about, we really want to try to do whatever we can to avoid that, because it's just extremely disruptive. And it doesn't mean that you can't get on the right track and get back on the right track. But what it does do is it kind of creates some chaos in your life, whether it's hoping people don't find out or explaining what happened or, kind of making sure that you get back on the right track. All of those things take a lot of energy and effort. And I'd prefer if we're using that energy and effort towards someone continuing to get healthier and healthier than to kind of stop going in the wrong direction and, using that to continue going in the right direction.
Well, and I think one of the things that I think we kind of shifted into is kind of that crisis call, right? I'm in a bad place. And I think for me, when I'm starting to work with people, it's really presenting the idea of one of the ways that this is going to be really successful for you, this process, is just getting more comfortable with regular check-ins with people, whether it's when you wake up, when you're on your way to work, on your lunch break, on your way home, before bed, whatever it is. Those just kind of become times to reach out and just update people on life and how things are going. And it could be 2 minutes, it could be 15 minutes. And for me, I try to break the day up into kind of 4 or 5 different parts. And if during that window of time, 2, 3, 4 hours, something's going on, that you're going to be able to check in with somebody. Whereas if you're waiting days or weeks to check in with somebody, a lot can build up.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we talk to people a lot is about self-awareness, kind of an understanding of how they're feeling and what's going on in their head and what's going on for yourself. And I think that one of the things that happens when we're in an unhealthy place is we try to avoid that because we don't feel good. We don't really want to be self-aware because we don't like what that feels like. And by checking in with people, essentially you're forcing yourself to think about that. They're going to ask you, how are you doing? How are you feeling? So that kind of forces you to come into that self-awareness. And that's where the key comes in of really, one of the cornerstones of any recovery work is honesty, and beyond that, transparency. And if somebody's asking me how I'm doing and I'm checking in and I'm thinking to myself, really, how am I doing? And then if I can remain honest in that moment, then I will tell them, hey, I'm struggling a little bit, or I'm not doing that well, or hey, I've had a lot of thoughts about things that scare me, or whatever that is. And so as we continue to help people learn how to be more self-aware and kind of check in with themselves, that conversation or connection to someone else forces that and kind of puts us in a place where we have to think about that and notice things that we might not notice on our own because we just haven't really thought about it. But that connection is forcing us to think about that. And then again, the key to that is just being honest and transparent. And if you're not doing well, then you need to get to the point where you can share that with somebody, because then what that does is help us kind of shift gears a little bit and get headed in the right direction.
So I mean, obviously we're talking so much about kind of the benefits and the pros of this. What are the barriers? What are you hearing from people that's getting in the way of seemingly utilizing something that can be so beneficial?
I mean, I believe the biggest thing that gets in the way is pride. People list it as different things, pride or ego or those types of things. And I think that as human beings, and maybe particularly as Americans, is we are taught to be strong and to be able to work through things and to, just get through the tough times and those types of things. And so I think that by reaching out, you're acknowledging that things aren't, you are doing well. I mean, not always. I guess sometimes reaching out, you can be doing great. But at the end of the day, I think that it's this want and need. We figured out this issue that we're dealing with. We don't like it. We wish we didn't have this issue. And part of that is wanting to will ourselves through that and to show to ourselves and to others that we can be okay. And so I think that there's, as I mentioned earlier, I think there's a feeling of vulnerability by telling someone else that you might be struggling. And that for a lot of people, being vulnerable is really difficult, in, kind of acknowledging that everything's not going great or not feeling great. And so I think that that's what gets in the way. First and foremost, I think it's pride and feeling like somehow by reaching out that that's a weakness. And, ironically, I look at that as a huge strength. If somebody's willing to do that because their themselves, their life, their families are important enough to basically push through that pride because this is going to be something that's going to help them be a better person or live a better life, then I respect that a lot. When somebody reaches out to me and tells me they're struggling, it's like, I have the utmost respect for that person because I know it's difficult. And if you want to show that you're strong, I guess, then the strength is being able to acknowledge that in that moment and push through that pride and ego and use the tools that are out there to help you stay on the right track.
Yeah. As the therapist, one of the scariest things I hear from people is I'm fine. Especially kind of at the time in which I'm meeting with people, it tends to be really early on in recovery, or there's a lot of things going on, challenges going on. And if somebody is so conditioned to just say, I'm fine, which we all are to some degree, it's scary because it's kind of like that transition hasn't happened yet to, oh yeah, this is going on or that's going on, which is such an important transition to make. And, and you touched on it, Derek, which is kind of the courage and or the strength of sharing with somebody what's actually going on. And I think as somebody that kind of is an observer of progress for people, that's definitely one of the markers that I'm looking for is, are they beginning to see the power and the strength in sharing? Because ultimately that's probably going to be a kind of an indicator that people really are on the path to getting really healthy.
Absolutely. I had an old mentor in my career before I was a therapist, and he was a very successful guy. And that one of the pieces of advice he gave me is that, if you want to be successful, you can't let your pride and ego get in the way of hiring people that are better than you. And I think it's just a lesson in life that if we can learn to kind of push through pride and ego and understand what good decisions are, whether it's in life, whether it's in recovery, and ultimately what that means, what we're talking about is reaching out And if you can kind of surpass that and get past that part where you just want to do it on your own and prove to the world that you can do this, then I think that that's a really, really great strength to have and one of the key components of solid recovery.
Well, and I think that moving forward, I mean, I think we just continue to role model this behavior as this is something that we really value. We can't just be people that sit in a chair and say, you got to do this. I think one of the ways that I try to kind of emulate or role model this is to be somebody that actually practices this. And for me, that probably is one of the ways that I try to kind of bring this into the counseling session is to not just kind of be up in the clouds dictating, hey, you got to do this or you got to do that, but actually be practicing it.
Yeah. And I think this goes back to, I think we talked about this on a previous episode, but like for friends and family and therapists and anybody who is in a position where they're trying to support somebody who is going through some tough work and some tough things in their life, I think that kind of maintaining, it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning, it's maintaining that connection. And it's not that every conversation has to be super deep and meaningful and heart to heart, but you want to make it easy for people to reach out when things aren't going well. And one of the ways to do that is to establish that connectivity at all times. And so that call, they in the recovery world, they call it the 5,000-pound phone. To pick up that phone and to reach out to somebody is a really difficult thing. And so for those of us who are trying to support people, we need to try to make that less heavy. We need to try to make that as easy as possible. And one of the ways we can do that is by just kind of, making sure that we're keeping up that connection and we're making it easy for them to reach out when things aren't going well.